Thank you all for staying through the conference. It's been a generative conversation over the last 2.5 days for those of us who have been here through the entire discussion. Many of us in the room, I recognize many faces, have actually participated over the last 10 years. And I think we would all be very remiss if we were not to pause just for a moment. There's no Wagner playing right now, as you know, like it did at the beginning. But I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Claudia, who is sitting up front, but I think she's in the back right now, and Professor Peter and the staff, Charlotte, Lorenz, and others, for bringing us all together for a successful conversation here in Munich again this year. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Claudia. We really are fortunate to close out the discussion during this session that will lead us into the MSc for many of us with a rather remarkable panel. I know that many of the faces on the stage today, many of you recognize. We also have some really new, important parties that have joined us this afternoon. I think, as many of you know, throughout the conversation that we've had over the last day and a half, there has not been a lot of good news. The last panel ended with a little bit of good news about what the financial services are doing right, but we're being challenged on all fronts, and I think, as many of you have probably seen on your phones, just in the last hour, minutes, national media in Russia is reporting, and major media outlets around the world are reporting the death of Navalny. This is a challenging time, and we have a panel who have worked for many, many years, some the longest warfighters in cyber in history. We're delighted to have Admiral Mike Rogers. Mike has been in the trenches. Many of you know him. You know his face. You've read his statements over the years. He is the quintessential cyber warrior. He started it. He's been doing it. He's been doing it for almost 40 years. And he's also just a good friend to have. So thank you very much, Mike, for joining us this afternoon. Emily Goldman from Current Cyber Command. She's a strategist, a theorist, an author, helps develop the strategy at U.S. Cyber Command. We're delighted to have you this afternoon. Thank you. We've got Manfred Boudreaux. Manfred is joining us from NATO. He's the CIO at NATO. Despite he who shall not be named's comments from the United States, I hail from Washington, so I won't reference him. The President of the United States at least has come out in support of NATO unequivocally, and we're delighted to have you this afternoon. Pekka has joined us as well, one of the newest members of NATO from Finland. He runs Cyber Command in Finland at MCSC, so thank you for joining us. And of course, the panel would not be complete without another thought leader who many of you recognize, a former thought leader at WEF on cybersecurity, currently at the Hague Center, Alex. So thank you, Alex, for joining us. We're going to start right away if we can. Yesterday, Chris Ahlberg interviewed, as they referred to themselves as two old spies. Many of you were here for that discussion, and every year I look forward to it. But for 10 years, this conversation has gone on. And in past years, the same question has been asked of those spies. And that is, who wins? Will we win? And our good friend and colleague who hosted the panel yesterday mumbled quietly, and some of you may have picked it up. She said, who is we? And we, of course, for that panel's perspective, is the enlightened world. Will the enlightened world win? Will autocrats win? That has been the conversation, and obviously Navalny's death today continues to pose that question in real terms for us. Mike, maybe to you first. When we heard Sir Alex answer that question yesterday on the panel, I did not hear a quick response of, we will win. In fact, I heard caution, I heard some reticence, I heard concerns. We've heard concerns throughout today. We had the Secretary of Homeland Security from the United States. Claudia, thank you for joining us. We had the Secretary of Homeland Security from the United States this morning start with a new paradigm, because he said that the paradigm we're currently living in with a laissez-faire approach and market control mechanisms without government controls and interjections are leading to market failure and, in his words, dire consequences. We heard from Lisa Monaco about the economic failures and the need for prosecutions, and we certainly heard throughout the day and from the Deputy Director of the Commission yesterday about some of the needs for regulation here in Europe, even in a non-homogenized regulatory environment in order to advance the market. So Mike, how do we win? Are we winning? What allows us to win?
So look, I tend to be an optimist by nature, but I will tell you my bottom line. If we keep doing what we're doing now, we are not going to win and we're not going to get where we need to be. I'm struck a little bit what I haven't heard in this conference. As we close out 2023, we have hit all-time highs in ransomware, all-time high in penetrations, all-time high in successful data extractions. Think about what that means. Guys, we're not hitting the mark. And I'm not here to throw stones. Look, I, as you heard, I've been a part of this. I've been very focused on this. It means a lot to me. But I'm struck by, we have got to get out of our comfort zones, and we've got to be willing to try very different alternative approaches. Because doing more of the same and thinking you're going to get a different outcome, my military experience teaches me that's a low probability of success strategy. And I don't say that to just be pejorative. I am struck by, we are all too often focusing on effort and not enough on performance. What do we mean by that? Emily used to have to deal with this for me all the time. I would say to the team, stop talking to me about effort. We recognize and acknowledge effort. But folks, what we value is performance and outcome. So don't quote to me how much money we're spending. Don't quote to me how many people we have working these problems. What I'm interested in my previous life as a commander was, talk to me about metrics that indicate that those things are translating to successful outcomes. That's what I care about. Could we focus on metrics that really identify, are we succeeding or are we not succeeding? So we started this conference off, the very first thing I heard was, we should feel better because criminals are having to work harder. And I mentally thought to myself, are you kidding me? So I should feel good because criminals are working harder to steal more and more money. That doesn't make me feel, personally, it doesn't make me feel good. So I just think the bottom line is we have got to stop confusing effort with performance, and we've got to get out of our comfort zones. And there are some great models that we're going to talk about later.
Manfred, thank you very much for that opening remark. Manfred, maybe we go to you first with that takeaway on the metrics and performance. We did see some performance change in Ukraine, and some of the panelists have touched on this over the last 48 hours. We heard yesterday from Sir Jeremy that defenders have real agency, and we saw that in Ukraine, he said. And he said that the public and private sectors had rallied outside and within Ukraine to connect the dots and enhance the resiliency and the efficacy of defense in Ukraine. To Mike's point about performance measurement, from the NATO perspective, how are you measuring performance? What do those metrics look like in Ukraine? What do we do right? What do we need to keep doing? And what do we need to do more of?
Right. So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Specifically for Ukraine, I think a lot of things have gone really, really right when it comes to rallying people together from a technology perspective and a cyber perspective. And I think what has gone absolutely right is this unique combination of the civil part of the government, of the military, of industry, and really of society at large that came together and gelled in a way that I've never seen that before anywhere else. And if we think about that, they moved major systems to the cloud within a number of days. I think it was about 14 days that this took. And so everybody who works, especially in a public administration, in a public setting, to get something done in a matter of a couple of weeks, that's really very remarkable. So I think I want to take that as an inspiration as we look at larger organizations that obviously work in a different environment, different rule set, but we should be inspired by the speed and by the agility that Ukraine exercised in moving things into the cloud environment in a safe way. And I think it's also validated by the fact that the big cyber attacks that we had all dreaded for Ukraine, they have really not happened in that way. And I think there is, we can all speculate as to why. Did they really not happen, or were they thwarted successfully? But I think that there is a lot is to be said with how Ukraine has organized that move to the cloud, that fortification of cyber, that's very, very successful.
How does it look from a tough neighborhood, Pekka?
Yeah, looking from the border, long border with Eurasian. First of all, thanks for having me here. The Ukrainian example and how we look at it in Finland is that if we combine our forces that we all know and we all have a insight from different angles, then there is a possibility to the first question to win. I think that now we are in the tie. And I don't know, and I don't yet foresee how the end game will be. But I'm pretty sure that if we are taking the example from there, what we have seen in Ukraine, then we have the possibility. The examples are there already. For instance, if we look at how the FBI conducted the snake operation, together with different partners from around the world, and also the World Typhoon, there is the example for us how we can actually win. And for me, the most important thing there is that they follow the rules of the democratic society. So they had the court to say that this is okay. Because there is, yes, you all know it, because Manfred said the speed. And maybe there is for us, there might be the opinion that in the democratic countries, everything is slow. And then there is, I think that there is at least a conversation. Should we now just ignore everything what there is in the law, just to do it, because it's fast? But are we then on the right side? Are we then on the opposite, what we are now against? We must follow the rules, what we have, everyone with what we have built to us. I think
concept of having an important metric of normative standards, value systems, alignment, not only on the technical, but on the cultural and the rule sets governing that behavior. You mentioned Volt Typhoon. I know a number of the panels today have discussed that. That is not a risk that's behind us. We're still struggling with that. We had a hearing in front of Congress just last week in front of the China Select Committee that is focused on issues associated with Volt Typhoon. And the release that Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco mentioned during her speech specifically was related to that collective defense. We had a number of intelligence agencies from here in Europe and the United States burn intelligence in order to support that collective defense model. And Mike, from your perspective, how do we measure that? Is it working? Are those types of collective defense techniques and tactics that we're using, where they come at great cost, are they of high efficacy?
So first, I think the takeaways for me are for Ukraine are, number one, they pivoted to a fundamentally different model. They really took integration to a whole different level. Secondly, they did that because they came to the conclusion that they faced such a magnitude level of threat that they needed to do something fundamentally different. And yet if you take away all the talk, I still don't see that yet in cybersecurity. I only speak for my nation. I'm a little worried that my own society is getting a little numb to the just endless drip, drip, drip of this penetration, this problem. And I just worry a little bit that people are just starting to tune this out. And so what is it that drives us to this realization that our Ukrainian teammates did, for example, that, hey, look, we're facing such a magnitude of threat, we got to fundamentally do something different here, or we're not going to work, it isn't going to work. Collective defense, collective measures, integration clearly are going to be a part of this. But one of my takeaways from my experience, and I penetrated networks for a living, I defended networks for a living, so I know what it's like. I was responsible for defending the Department of Defense networks, and there's more than a few people who are interested in penetrating and messing with the data in those areas. And one of my takeaways from that experience was there is no one single solution here. So it isn't just going to be, well, we're going to be more collective, or technology is going to save us, or fill in the blank. To me, it was about, we got to get together with a coherent strategy. We've got to divide this into a series of tasks, and then we've got to execute the tasks, and we've got to assess our performance over time. I hear tons of rollouts of new programs. I seldom hear us go back, so a year, 18 months later, is that working? Has it achieved the desired outcome? Is the money that we are putting into it still the smartest way, or is there something different? To me, we don't tend to do that. I just think this part of this process we're going to have to go through is continual assessment, continual focus on performance, and this idea of integration and a collective approach is the best way to do it. Because not one organization, I'm proud of being a military guy in my previous life. The militaries of the world can't do this by themselves, nor should they. We wouldn't want them doing this.
Alex, we heard Ali Mayorkas this morning, Secretary Mayorkas, indicate, I think very similar to what Mike was just stating, that we've had market failure. And that over the last 30 years, the laissez-faire approach, he called it, to cybersecurity has not worked. And again, the dire consequences have resulted. Mike's proffering that Ukraine allowed for a different strategic and tactical response because of the risk, the magnitude of the risk that was presented. And I think all of us who work in this space are very familiar with that driving mechanism for both strategic and tactical response. We've also heard many panels over the last day and a half focusing on the alternative, the Coase theorem, move the needle through regulation. And we've had from regulators represented here to industry to thought leaders speaking on the different regulatory frames. Is that an equal driver to great risk to shift us out of that laissez-faire approach? What are your thoughts on the regulatory frame?
Thank you, and thank you first of all to the organizers. I've been part of this conference series since 2016, and it's amazing how it's expanded. And we certainly need more chairs. I have to agree with what was said yesterday. That was quite impressive.
Takeaway number one: more chairs. There we go.
First of all, I really identified with what Secretary Mayorkas said, in particular about moving us closer to a whole-of-nation resilience model. We need to shift the defense question purely from the customer and the user up the chain of command. And in particular, what I think some of the new regulations have shown us is that it's also important to put responsibility not at the mid-levels of the organization or a company, but really at the boards, and make sure the boards are aware of this issue. So the World Economic Forum Cybersecurity Outlook last year basically said that 94% of cyber leaders thought that in the next 2 years there was going to be a major cyber incident. Those are the cybersecurity leaders. If you ask the boards, they're going to go ask my technical guy, ask my CISO, ask my CSO, and none of them will actually be at the board level. And what we've seen in the new rules in the Security Exchange Commissions that were enacted just a couple of months ago, that boards will now have a responsibility to show that they've been properly appraised of cybersecurity risk. So we won't have the situation that arose, for instance, with SolarWinds, where the CISO of SolarWinds gets blamed for the failure of the company as a whole. Which is not really, a good way to go, since it's not going to really change the way things operate. We've seen a similar thing happen in the Network Information Security Directive too, which under Article 20 also says that boards need to show that they've been properly appraised of cyber risks. They can't push it off to the side, or they can't push it downwards. They have to take responsibility. And that continues with the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is important for financial services. And I think it's something that will lead to a little bit of a change in mindset in business about how to deal with this risk. And it's just not another risk, but it's a really transformative issue that we all have to deal with. The second thing that's happening in regulation that I find really interesting is just some new imaginative thinking. And the Cyber Solidarity Act was mentioned by the Vice President of the European Commission yesterday, and that might be really transformative. We're looking at not only a cyber emergency mechanism that can be enacted by the EU Commission in case a significant cyber incident occurs, but we're even looking at something called a cyber reserve, which basically would be a number of information security professionals, cyber defenders from the private security companies, that will be deployed on retainer, paid for by the Commission, to an incident, not only in an EU member state, but if negotiations go the way they are right now, even to places like Ukraine. And that's interesting, because then it moves the entire resilience discussion back into the deterrence. So suddenly, the European resilience capabilities can actually be a deterrent capability. And I think that's really fascinating. It's a way to basically also drive the discussion forward.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think it's really important, some of the points that you're raising, but you're also raising a really important point for the operators like Pekka, who confront the non-harmonized or non-homogenized regulatory developments, whether they're transatlantic based or non-homogenized even within the United States, here in Europe, Asia. We heard from the Japanese just a few moments ago on their developments. when those of us that operate globally, as everyone on this panel does, and many of us in the audience do as well, we know that part of the hardest job in cyber is not only the defensive element, and as Mike indicated, how do we measure ourselves, but it's conducting arbitrage across all of these different complex standards and regimes and navigating them. How are you doing that in Finland? Now that you're a member of NATO, there are new requirements on you. You have all the EU requirements. How is that going?
It's a struggle, I'll be honest with you. It's a struggle for following all of the regulation what's coming. And being responsible at some point of the implementation of everything of that, it's an interesting game of different opinions, what to do, what to be a role. But what I wanted to emphasize is that what was mentioned here, the importance of the regulation is always to start getting some more information to CEO level, that it is there. And when, for Finland, for example, when talking about NIS2, I have never seen this kind of conversation in the CEO level about the cybersecurity than it's now because of the NIS2 regulation. There might be even fines coming to the companies and so on and so forth. So now it's under their interest in the management boards every time that how we can actually cope with the new regulation. And that is important. But I want to highlight we had yesterday the cybersecurity directors meeting before this great conference. And the other thing that was mentioned then, and it was mentioned in the regulative panel yesterday, that give us some time to implement those. Don't just push forward new regulations, because we are doing something also in country. And we are implementing those, so please give us some time that we can implement those correctly, and then there can be some new regulators coming. Thanks.
We heard earlier from both Majorkas as well as the DAG that under our new programs in the United States, and we know that the UK has adopted a similar type model, and Europe is driving in this direction and leading with an ISD2, of course, and we're behind on that in the US, that under the strategy this White House has put together, they're trying to drive the responsibility away from the lowest common denominator, the consumer or the user, and drive it up to the responsible parties, the manufacturers, the leading cloud providers, the technology providers, telecommunications. That is obviously a very significant shift, not only in our policy and our regulatory frame, but in our model of performance. That's going to require a different level, will it not, Mike, in that public-private partnership collaborative that we just heard from our colleagues from Japan? How can the large players, the infrastructure players, engage in efficacious defense without further enhancing further collaboration with cyber commands, your operation, Pekka, and others?
Well, look, Emily's going to have a view on this with her experience. And I'll riff just slightly. Another thing that struck me in the last day and a half, we spent a lot of time talking about regulation. I hardly heard zero comment about incentives. I'm like, look, I was in government for 37 years, and in my experience, governments are very good at what must you do and what you cannot do. Where I wish we'd see a little bit more from governments is, so how can we take the capacities, how can we take the policies, how can we take the mechanisms that governments have available to them and translate them into incentives that help shape private sector behavior and reward the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? In my experience as a military guy, when you go with broadly a focus purely on regulation, I'm not saying that's all we're doing, but a focus on regulation, in my experience, tends to lead you to I'll meet the minimum standard. You know, I'll comply, but I'll meet the minimum. And my view is, look, to get where we need to go, it can't be about the minimums. We've got to strive to be something better. But Emily's going to have a view on
That's exactly right.
the regulatory
So
piece.
this is going to be our final question that Emily, now that we've identified some of the problems, and Emily, if you have not read her book, I would urge you to do it. She's taken us forward. And as you know from the sign right behind Emily's head, ways forward on the cyber conundrum is the topic of this conversation. And we have burdened Emily and asked her kindly to lead us in a discussion now. on the conference discussion here. This conference has been going on for 10 years, and we've had many discussions over the last 10 years. Emily, I think if you can, we've heard a lot of challenges, including from this panel. What are the 2 to 3 dots that you see that would allow us 10 years from now, if Professor Peter and Claudia bring us together again, where this conversation on this panel is not about looking back as to why we lost?
So I'm going to talk about blobs, not dots, because I've been waiting patiently here. So I think the first question goes directly to the one that you asked. I got to call him Admiral Rogers. I know I got to call you Mike, but it's strange. Basically, when we say do we win, the question is, what do you mean by win? Okay, so as a former academic, I'm going to define it. It means, can we outcompete? Can we reduce strategic loss in competition? And can we set conditions to prevail in crisis and conflict, right? And the comment about, what Ukraine is learning, they're learning it within a conflict environment, okay? And we, at least the United States, is still in a competition environment. So we need to understand, first of all, that these are distinct geopolitical conditions, and we have to understand how cyber plays out in each of them. So, my answer would be 10 years out, we, quote, win if we get our strategy right, okay? And that means we have to understand the strategic environment, that cyber is different from the conventional and the nuclear environment, that it's an interconnected space, and we are in constant contact all the time with adversaries who can reach out and touch our national sources of power directly. Okay, they can seize our wealth, they can steal our IP, they can sow discord and distrust of our democratic institutions. And so in order to deal with this challenge, we have to be the ones that have the initiative. We have to be setting the conditions so that they're in our favor. That's exactly what Lisa Monaco was talking about. She's talking about a strategy of disruption to accompany the defense, to accompany the resilience, okay? Because this is an active operational space, and our adversaries figured this out before we did. Right? In the Department of Defense, we've adopted a more proactive approach, and it was just so heartening to hear Lisa talk about that in the context of what the FBI is doing. So I think that's the first part, that we have to be proactive, we have to be anticipatory, and we have to be setting the conditions in our favor. I think Volt Typhoon is really interesting because what it says to me is that is the PRC structuring the contingency space. They are saying, what is the kind of war we want to fight, and how do we set those conditions now, right? And that's what we need to be doing. And part of that, that came out of the learning from Ukraine is that, for example, we need to fight as a coalition, we need to have secure warfighting networks, and we need to set those conditions now. We can't wait until the next conflict erupts. So I think the big one is to get the strategy right. We call it initiative persistence, persistent engagement. Lisa called it a strategy of disruption. So that's the first one. And the second is simply the idea that we have to have a campaigning mindset, okay? This has got to be whole of nation plus. This is not about, we continue to talk about incidents and hacks, right? Many of these are strategic campaigns that are spread out over long periods of time. And so we need to start thinking about those as campaigns, and our DoD cyber strategy talks about the need for our military to campaign. And I think, finally, the last point I would make is that because cyberspace is so deeply interconnected, we have to deal with the segmentation that exists within our governments. We tend to divide roles and responsibilities based on different organizations. Sir Jeremy talked about the divide between foreign and domestic. Our adversaries do not look at it that way. So we have to create synergy. So for every single decision that comes before you, every organizational decision, you should ask, is this going to create more synergy or more segmentation? And always go for synergy.
Can I ask you one other to follow up? Lisa mentioned that tempo matters in the strategy. And we also heard yesterday, along the lines of what you just referenced and Mike said earlier about, from Sir Jeremy, the drip, drip, drip nature of these things. How does the strategy that you've developed for Cyber Command address both of those principles of tempo, this longer term issue that you've raised of just drip, 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 and then when we accumulate it, it becomes significant, not just event driven.
Right.
And then Mike's question around performance. Are we measuring performance fairly and accurately?
Right. So I think that the drip, drip, drip is about the fact that that cyberspace has made strategic competition consequential for the balance of power in the global system. All right. So if North Korea can exploit cryptocurrency to circumvent sanctions and fund its ballistic missile programs to the point where they have a weapon that can hit the continental United States, I think that's pretty consequential, right? And so what this is about the fact that any particular incident is not in itself significant, but the cumulative impact over time is consequential. So the challenge that we face is how do you measure cumulative impact, right? And how do you demonstrate value to that? What we have seen is that we need to be able to, we talk about defending forward, which is, I think of it more in terms of defending forward in time. It's becoming anticipatory. It's understanding, gaining insight. We have hunt forward operations where we work with partners to try to gain insight and help them clean their networks out, right? And then we share that information with the private sector, right? Those are things that are proactive, right? But it's not offensive, right? We recognize that what Lisa was talking about, there has to be this element of contesting, of disrupting, right? But I think the way to think about it is how do we preclude the adversary from being successful? Because they're going to continue to try to do this because the incentives are too great. So we have to understand our own vulnerabilities. All of the discussion about regulation, is really about us trying to figure out how to set conditions in our favor.
Can I get you to answer one more question about that? And when you're aggregating, as you've described, and the need to do that, are we aggregating only domestically in the United States? Are we aggregating across Europe, among the Five Eyes? How does that aggregation work, and what do we need to be doing in terms of aggregation to assess that risk?
So I think, yes, it makes sense to talk about collectively the challenges that it's sort of the death by 1,000 cuts. And the United States is clearly not the only one. Every country represented here has gone through that. But I think the other point is to look at it from the obverse side and to say, what are we collectively doing through cooperation, coordination, operational integration, right? What are we collectively doing to create collective value, right? Not only to make our militaries more secure and able to have mission assurance for if they have to fight, but also to what extent we're enabling our economic values and our domestic political resiliency, right? So this is the challenge. Anybody out there have the solution to how you measure the cumulative impact? We are working on that now, and it's...
Brilliant. Alex, thoughts on those dots that we need to connect so that we're not sitting here 10 years from now?
Or lose in the next 10 years completely. Yeah, so I can't answer the question that was just posed. As the only person on the panel who has never had to assume operational responsibility, my answer is more academic. But I would like to go back to what Sir Alexander said yesterday, that the ultimate objective of China, and we can add Russia and all the other authoritarian states, is to build a top-down internet. They want to replace the current bottom-up, multi-stakeholder, free internet that we have right now with an intergovernmental internet, not only because, as Sir Alexander said, their geopolitical security concerns are best suited that way, but also their domestic security concern. Their very own personal survival depends on a state-controlled internet. So if that's the point of departure, besides all the other operational goals that national security has to deal with overall, but the long-term objective of what we have to deal with, then we come to another question, which for me is actually what the cyber conundrum is. The cyber conundrum actually means, what is a cyber conundrum? And for me, that is that we see cyber warfare, but it actually is information warfare. So we actually had some great panel yesterday on disinformation, and that is now becoming its own silo, very much with their own topics, their own levels of discussion. But I think that the adversary doesn't really differentiate that much between cyber operations and disinformation operations. For them, it's a continuum. And most importantly, decision-making and policy-making is the ultimate goal for them. So there is, of course, operational preparation of their environment. There is pre-positioning for battlefield cyber, all of that, and definitely intellectual property theft. But the ultimate battle is winning the basic narrative discussion of where will the internet go. And therefore, I think what we really need to do to make sure that in 10 years we still have an internet is that we need to invest not in technology, but in what Kofi Annan said, policy innovation. When Kofi Annan said the internet was a technological miracle, now we need a policy miracle to go with it. And that basically means we need to reinvest and secure the multi-stakeholder model. And the cyber conundrum is, when we start talking about cybersecurity, we inevitably talk mostly about government, a little bit about the private sector, and we never talk about civil society, who still actually run and maintain and build most of the internet. And that weakens the multi-stakeholder model. So how do we actually solve this conundrum? How do we invest in cybersecurity, which is, and the government prerogative of national security, while at the same time supporting the free internet that we have right now, and not slowly drip by drip undermining it and creating this intergovernmental internet that actually China and Russia really want to have.
Emily, will you respond on information warfare and that point?
Yeah, so just briefly, I think information operations or information warfare is probably one that Admiral Rogers can comment on. We are incredibly segmented within the US government. I mean, we created it and we've renamed it and repartitioned it, and so that is a real challenge. Taking it more broadly, I mean, I see that, you know, there's cyber-enabled information operations, and then there's cyber that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with changing the narrative, but it's simply about exploiting for gain, right, for strategic gain, whether it's theft, et cetera. So I think that those are distinct. I think they're both going on. And I think that the challenge that democratic governments have is that from the government perspective, we feel it is legitimate to address the connectivity, the pipes through which the information flows. We don't think it's really appropriate to deal with the content, okay? Because unless it's something that is child pornography, right, like off the table. But then when it comes to this notion of cognition, right, these are sort of three different levers in the information domain, we don't think the government has a role, whereas our authoritarian adversaries actually do, and they work seamlessly across all of those mechanisms, and they practice on their own populations, and then they export that technology and techniques outward on the rest of the world. So that's
Pekka?
another conundrum.
Absolutely.
Yeah, after 10 years, I was thinking about the title of the panel was Connecting the Dots, and I started to imagine myself, what are those dots actually? And I realized that when I hear all the panels in here, and I started to calculate all the panels and all the representatives of the different organizations who are present in this room also. If we could be able to connect all the information that you and your organizations have already in you, we would win. But have we done that? No. We have established several centers in Europe, and all the time there is a new initiative that there will be a new center, because the problem is always the information sharing. And the answer every time is the same: establish a new center. We have seen that. Let's not go any more further on those. I think that the solution is that, yes, there is the legislative problems in some countries and to share the information, and that is right. But I still argue it's more about the attitude. So if we can combine those, what we do know inside in every individual and in every company, so that it's effective, then it's possible to do. And if the information is classified, because that is often said to me that, hey, Pekka, this is classified information, declassify it. Make something. Because the companies are doing the job and they cannot handle the classified information. The label, if the label is secret, what can you do? You can show it quickly to the CEO and he would never see it again. And what was there? I didn't understand. So we need some actionable information to there. Then we can win.
Manfred.
David, will we win? Yes, yes we will, but not without stringent effort. So I'm optimistic, and so the question is what I think would contribute to this winning. And as the NATO CIO, it's not a surprise that one of these things will be collaboration. So I really do believe in collaboration across all of the different sectors, whether it's public, private, society, academia, industry. There was a couple of panels ago, there was a statement that was made that we are not going to collaborate our way out of the cybersecurity problem. I disagree. I think we are going to collaborate our way out of it, but it needs to be organized in a better way. Kind of going back to Pekka, what you said, right? It doesn't have to be another body that's coming together, but it needs to be, it's an information and knowledge management problem. If we could consolidate the information that is in this room and outside of this room for the side that is fighting for the good, I think, in the war of cybersecurity, I think that will go a long way. The second thing that I'd like to contribute, and I've really been thinking about this in the past couple of days a lot, this whole regulation thing. And so, Mike, I don't think we can also regulate our way out of that. That would not be the right answer. But then when I look at some of the basic things that we're doing today that we're doing wrong, like the 5 zeros as a password, right? I think those things need to be regulated. I think there's some very basic things. If we could have appropriate regulation on a couple of different things, widespread adoption, combined probably with a commercial motivation to do that, not just kind of to have the whip, but you need also a carrot, and the carrot would be the commercial motivation as to how to do that. That would go a long way, and I think the combination of appropriate, sensible regulation and collaboration, that would be the answer of how we could win this game.
Emily, will you comment on the construct around collaboration as a enhancing defensive mechanism in the context of the point you made? And I think you've made it publicly for the first time on cognition. I think it's a very important point. I have not heard that over the last 48 hours in the discussion so far. I think I looked around the audience and I saw a lot of heads nodding when you made that point. Will that work? Will cooperation, enhanced cooperation, address the cognition problem? Will what Lisa laid out, purposeful, at-pace prosecution for norm violation, does that address cognition? How do we get there on cognition?
That's a really tough problem because I think that democratic states view information differently than authoritarian states. Right? I mean, we view it as a way to make better decisions, right? We talk about decision advantage, information advantage. They view it as a way to control, kind of a global narrative, right? So I think it's going to be, I'm not sure that cooperation per se is the way that we're going to get our way out of that. I think fundamentally it's an existential challenge between information freedom and information control, right? And the question is, which one of those worlds do we want to live in, and what are we willing to do collectively to be in a world of information freedom? And that is going to have, downsides in the sense that there may be misinformation or disinformation, but usually more information is a better remedy to that than trying to limit it.
I think cognition sharing is an interesting concept. It builds on something I heard a couple of times, that we need more wisdom sharing rather than information sharing. So we have the IOCs, we have the IOAs, but we don't really have the context. We don't really know what's going on. Why are they doing this? What is going to be the next target? So if you want to do anticipative preventive action, then you have to know roughly what are their end goals, what are they trying to accomplish. And that hasn't been the focus in information security and cyber defense. Previously, we were only about defense. We didn't even care really who the actors were. They were just going at, we defend. We don't care about attribution. That used to be 5, 6, 7 years ago the case. Now we're talking about the actors. Now, next we have to talk about where do those actors live, what are their motivations, where are they going to go next. And that's going to help us really understand what the end game is of all this. Because at the moment, we're just playing whack-a-mole.
Mike?
Well, first, I'm going to disagree with one thing. Look, collaboration to me is I'll do my thing, you do your thing, and we'll each tell each other what we're doing, and we'll each try to make each other smarter. My view is that is, number one, doesn't give you speed. Number two, it tends to be reactionary. It doesn't let you get ahead of problem sets. My answer is, look, guys, the future is integration. It is about working side by side 24/7 with each other. That gives us speed, that gives us in-depth knowledge, and that lets us get ahead of problems. The other challenge I have with collaboration, just based on my own experience, is it tends to keep us in our silos. And one of the things I found when I was in government, I did not understand the business dynamic well, and I didn't understand what tended to shape What did they value? What was most important to them? And how are they structured? I just didn't understand that as a government guy, as a military guy. Likewise, now that I find myself in the commercial world, I'm going, you don't really understand the way governments work internally. You don't understand really what the outcome is they're trying to achieve. And you don't really understand the processes and the structures, good or bad. So to me, integration also gives us the opportunity to really get smarter about each other, because knowledge is power. And that gets us to speed, scale, and get ahead of the problem, which is where we want. If we're looking 10 years out, then the last three things I would say are, number one, I'm interested in integration and simplification. Integration and simplification. Can we make this easier? Part of our challenge is we are complicating the hell out of our solution sets. We literally are proposing solutions that are almost as complicated in execution as the problem we're trying to fix. I'm going, guys, you can't scale like this, and it's harder to execute like this. The second thing I'd be looking for is we tend to focus a lot on technology, regulation, all good things. In the end, cybersecurity is a human-driven enterprise, a human-driven set of activities. So I'm interested in how we maximize the value of human capital here. And then lastly, have we really stepped back and both asked ourselves, what do we need to do differently? And then are we continually reassessing? We just don't do that to me. We tend to make bets and that's it. And we just go down the road. I'm not saying it's bad, but you want to be an adaptive learning organization, and you want to be adaptive in learning in your approaches to cybersecurity. You don't do that if you don't continually reassess. You don't do that if you just declare a victory every 6 months with this new program that you've implemented, as effective as it may be.
We're going to open this up to questions. I hope this conversation has got some folks in the audience thinking. I'm sure.
Or mad, because you know when you're mad,
We've got one in the back. Please go ahead.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I have a question actually from the situation that is happening here and now. And we are in a day when MSC is opening. And looking at all the media, the Russians have taken over the narratives. Information about death of Navalny, all of the Putin's interviews, he's basically over the media for a week. And what is happening is that citizens are afraid. And everything that we've been discussing for the past 2 days, it's here and now. So what with all of those strategies that you've been talking about in 10 years, can we do to actually react now?
Emily, you want to take that one first? Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that we've learned is the power of information exposure, right? And the power of being able to do that to deny the narrative to an adversary, right? Or to the type of information. So you know, and to be able to do that proactively ahead of time and to do it continuously with speed, scale, and agility, right? And so there has to be a recognition, I think, of both the public and private sector working together on that, but we have to recognize that, you know, when the government wakes up in the morning, it thinks national security. When the private sector wakes up, it thinks profit. That's great, right? But it's about aligning those interests, not sort of thinking that somehow we're going to make the private sector have a national security as a primary value. It's just not in their nature. So we need to really work on that hard, because obviously this information space is built, it's run, it's designed by the private sector, right? But we're seeing authoritarian powers use it in ways that would violate what we would consider kind of acceptable.
I think what the question just illustrated was a cyber conundrum. It's like we have a situation where effectively fear is being raised, security issues are being raised, and the call for government to do something about it will and could potentially further the interests of the Russian and Chinese governments. They have, from the start, said that the internet must be a security issue above all else, meaning that it's subject to international treaties that they've been pushing, called the Code of Conduct of Information Security. And the baseline for that is known as lawfare, that they know that the law-abiding, rules-based nations are going to abide by a treaty, and the authoritarian powers don't plan on doing so. So this is exactly the type of reason, one of the reasons why when we hear these types of fear-mongering, if you will, or attempts to hijack the narrative, we need to push back with our model. And that means we need to have at this meeting not only the private sector and the governments, we need to have also the ICANNs, the ISOCs, the IETFs, the people that build the internet and run it, and who are increasingly being told by government that can't we just make a rule to make it easier, which is exactly not the solution, because that's not how the internet was built to begin with. And we do want to keep the internet we have, and not the internet that the adversary wants us to have.
Thank you for that great question. We've got another one here.
So, nice panel. Emily, Alex, great to see you again. I would like to maybe go back to what Mike said about the strategy, and also think about how we are bringing in the conflict prevention and confidence building part into the big power relations. Because what I heard from your panel a bit was like, we should hit harder and we should prevent them to hit us, and then they hit back and we hit harder. Of course, I understand it's an operational panel. Well, you know, I'm a diplomat, so I'm just wondering whether this conventional way of doing arms control and conflict prevention that we had in nuclear age, in conventional weapons age, is still maybe out there as some solution for us. We know that cyber norms process has been killed by Russians now in the United Nations, and none of the big powers is reviving it, unfortunately. But I think we should be probably having this kind of diplomatic strategy also as part of this broader strategy. So I'd like to maybe hear from our US colleagues mostly. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's definitely a part of it. One of the things that strikes me about one of the challenges for cyber is that the greatest set of actors in cyber are not nation state entities. They're either criminal groups or individuals. So how do we develop diplomatic solutions that address non-nation state constructs? It's not a criticism, it's just, hey, how do we go about doing this? So I think the diplomatic piece is definitely part of this, but I think part of the challenge with cyber is that it is so ubiquitous. You know, it's not driven by nation states. It's not owned and operated by nation states. It's not controlled by nation states. And yet, generally, we use diplomacy as a nation state framework for addressing very difficult, very hard, very important problems to our societies. I just think we got to ask ourselves, how could we flex from that to a solution set that expands the parties out there, if you will, that we're trying to deal with?
Emily, do those principles of ladder of escalation, deterrence,
No.
do they?
Sorry, no. It's okay. Read the book. No. So I'm not a
Anyone
fan.
who's read her book knows the answer to that question.
So I think that we just have to be really careful about the lessons that we take from, for example, the nuclear environment and impose them on the cyber environment, in part for some of the things that Mike has said, but also because in the nuclear environment, the costs were incontestable and everybody knew what they were. Okay, it was unambiguous and you could not defend, right? So you had to figure out a way not to go to war. I mean, that was an imperative and that was a shared understanding. We don't have that in cyberspace. And so I think we want to get to a point where we have shared understandings about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. I think that's going to evolve through practice over time and through us contesting behavior that we think is unacceptable and also publicly declaring that diplomatically. It's important to have conversations among like-minded states about norms, but in my view, norms are normal practice. So what we are seeing is normalized behavior. We don't like it, right? So the question is, how do we, and I think it's got to be through action, not just through talking, right? But diplomats have a huge role to play in that, obviously.
Thank you for that great question. We're going to take one more from the audience. Sir, thank you.
Thank you very much. Arthur from Arthur's Legal Amsterdam. The main thing here with integration or collaboration is data sharing and the lack of it. Indeed, I asked also some of your friends in multiple countries, how we're going to share data. And it's not only about, declassification. It's also about, the parties that are here in this group. We all have excuses. And the excuses are there. I make a top 6 out of it. I'm not going to now. It's classified as confidential. It's IP. I don't know how to share. It's not possible. And we all together need to actually to break down those excuses. So this is my call to you, of course, but also to the room. You know, we really need to focus on sharing data based on trust. It starts with breaking down those excuses. With that, we get to integration that Mr. Rogers definitely, and I fully agree with you. We would also actually raise innovation because we get more data also as industry players and others. So we actually, you know, hit multiple targets that we have been talking about the last two days. What do you think about this?
Go ahead, please, Pekka.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that was part of what I was talking about when I talk about the attitude. So there are some legislative issues, but those are a little bit backside there. Because then those excuses, I hear those constantly. It's something about that. And yes, follows must be wrote. The rules are there and we must follow those. But still those are excuses. So thanks for the comment.
Totally agree with the comment. The difficulty is how to organize it, right? The mechanics around that. And if we could solve that, I think we could solve the information and knowledge management issue, and that's, I think, where we need to focus on. We can call it collaboration or integration, but the fact is it needs to have a togetherness, otherwise we're not going to break through.
So the great question, the Cyber Solidarity Act will have something called the Cyber Emergency Mechanism. This is still up for negotiation, what it includes, but hopefully it would include also opt-out or override buttons on data protection issues and similar that have made our lives so difficult in InfoSec. So everyone here, please get involved. This is still a document to be negotiated in its final stages, and so everyone can provide input on that. And just a very quick point on norms that Healy raised beforehand, an alternative view on norms, is that by having these norms, we basically can officially state what's good and bad behavior in cyberspace. Former State Department official Michel Markov used to say, a violation of a norm confirms the norm. So basically, by having these documents out there that we've been negotiating for 10 years, we are able to go to the rest of the UN and basically say, Russia's been violating it, Russia's been violating it, Russia's been violating it. And when actually then the invasion happens that members of the US intelligence community have been predicting for a while, then the narrative all makes sense. And this is one of the reasons why so many nations were ready to condemn Russia's action against Ukraine at the beginning, because they have been normalized to expect bad behavior from Russia. And that was actually one of the main accomplishments of this norm narrative.
Yeah, just briefly, I think in terms of ways I think we could advance information sharing is, at least for the government, we have to become part of the broader ecosystem of the private sector. We got to go to them, understand, live with them, respect, right? And we've done that through one of our programs under advisement, where, being very sensitive to that. So I think that's one piece. On the government side, it's about a culture of writing for release, right? And we have that, where the presumption should always be that you're writing for release, right, to partners, right? And then you have to make the case for why you wouldn't do that.
Mike, you want to close this out?
Look, I would only close this out with, because I hate ending on a downer. I really do. As a leader, I always hated that, because I wanted the team to walk away from every engagement with, hey, I want us to feel good, I want us to feel positive, I want us to feel motivated, and I want our heads up, and we're going to solve these problems, guys, because that's what they're paying us for. Look, when I look at the MSC, I see MCSC, I see a forum that keeps growing. It shows you that there is great interest. Governments, the private sector, academic institutions, every area of the world is interested and focused on how do we create a more resilient, a more secure, highly networked world so that we can actually execute these business outcomes, these national security outcomes, and create better lives for ourselves, our friends, our families, and our fellow citizens, both in our own nations and globally. With motivated people, you can do great things. And I see a lot of motivated people here, which is really good. I just think the challenge for us is, how do we turn that motivation into concrete things, and how do we push ourselves to get out of our comfort zone? Because we're faced with a magnitude of a problem that, quite frankly, is really something that on a scale is just massive. And it permeates every facet of our lives, literally from work to personal. So we got outcomes that matter here, and I just want to say thanks for your willingness to be part of the solution here as we move forward.
The conversation has been great this afternoon. Thank you for such wonderful questions. I think we've at least identified some solutions to the conundrum. Hopefully in 10 years, we're here for Oktoberfest, not talking about why we failed. And again, if you will all join me not only in thanking this esteemed group of great thinkers and leading thinkers in the world of cyberspace, but also our two remarkable hosts and their staff, Lorenz. Thank you again. Thanks to the team. Peter, Claudia, thank you again for a great suggestion.